Arsenic for Tea, Chapter 9. After dinner, the men stayed in the dining room to smoke, and the women got up and went into the drawing room. Bertie and Stephen sat with the men, but although we four had been allowed to play at being grown up at dinner, it was very clear that we were no longer wanted with either the men or the women. "Can't you go and play, Daisy dear?" asked Lady Hastings, waving her hand vaguely. "The grown-ups want to talk. Miss Alston, make them play." "That's quite all right, Mummy," said Daisy sweetly. "We can look after ourselves. We'll play hide-and-seek." "Oh, if you're sure." Lady Hastings seemed glad to clear us from her mind. "But play quietly." "I shall look in on them from time to time." Miss Alston stared at us sternly, her handbag held against her stomach like a shield. I wriggled a bit under her gaze. I knew that Daisy was up to something, and I felt uncomfortably as though Miss Alston might know it too. Her oddness came through to me stronger than ever. "Beanie, you count," said Daisy, once Lady Hastings and Miss Alston had retreated into the drawing-room, Miss Alston giving one more searching look back at us as she closed the door. "Now you heard what Mummy said. We must be quiet, and that means staying upstairs on the first and top floors. Don't come back down to the ground floor, otherwise she'll be fearfully cross. All right?" I knew at once that Daisy was getting Kitty and Beanie out of the way for whatever she had in mind. Beanie nodded obediently, looking excited, and Kitty, who had opened her mouth to argue, sighed and closed it again. I could tell that Kitty wished she could be sitting with the grown-ups listening to gossip, but Beanie wanted to play, and so Kitty would not disappoint her. It really was awfully clever of Daisy, as usual. We all climbed the stairs to the first-floor landing, and then Beanie stood facing the stuffed owl on its pedestal, put her hands over her eyes, and began to count in a very carrying whisper. Kitty sighed again, looked at Daisy, and scampered off toward Lady Hastings' room and the front of the house. Daisy seized my hand, winked, and dragged me very loudly up the main stairs to the top floor, which creak and echo awfully. But when we reached the nursery landing, we carried on running across the hallway and down the servants' stairs again. The back stairs are not exactly a secret passageway, but all the same, no one ever seems to think of us using them, apart from Daisy. They are not for us. They are for Mrs. Doherty and Hetty and Chapman, and they are dark and steep and cold. We crept down very quietly on our tiptoes, hardly breathing, with our hands over our mouths to stop ourselves giggling. It was lovely to be doing something secret with Daisy again. We came up next to Lady Hastings' room and tiptoed past Beanie, who was still counting. Beanie needs all her concentration to count, so while she is doing it, she is quite oblivious to the rest of the world. It was very clever of Daisy to have suggested her as the finder. Kitty might have noticed that we were up to something, but Beanie, never. Then we crept down the main stairs into the soft, light hall of the hall, with its ticking grandfather clock and worn old paintings on the faded red walls. We sneaked over to the closed dining-room door and stared breathlessly at each other. I could hear deep men's voices through the wood. Daisy grinned at me. "Good work, Watson," she whispered. "The first part of our mission is complete. Now on to the second. By my calculation, we will have at least 15 minutes before Beanie even begins to suspect that we've broken our word and aren't hiding somewhere on the top 2 floors. 15 minutes that I mean to make the best possible use of. It's clear from what he said at dinner that Mr. Curtis is highly suspicious. All that rot about and the Ming being a fake. Don't you agree? Now, it is true that Daisy sometimes hairs off after the wrong scent, too fast to be altogether decent, but in this case I found myself agreeing with her. I did notice, though, that she was not mentioning how worryingly interested Mr. Curtis was in Lady Hastings. "He is being very odd," I said, which might not mean anything, but— "Exactly," said Daisy, as if I had backed her up entirely. "If even you think so, then we must be on to something. I don't like him, and I don't like him being in my house. Mummy is sometimes not very bright about people, and in this case I don't trust her judgment at all. As I said before, he must be watched, and this game gives us the perfect opportunity to do so. If someone finds us, we can just say perfectly truthfully that we're hiding, and if we aren't found, we may be able to observe Mr. Curtis doing something compromising. He ought to be coming out of the dining room soon, after all. All right?" I looked at her. Daisy gets very protective about the things that are hers, and I thought that she had hit on it when she said, "I don't like him, and I don't like him being in my house." But it was still the most interesting potential case we had hit on for months. If this wasn't worth investigating, nothing was. And after all, I told myself, whatever happened, this case would be safe. It could not possibly turn into a murder. "All right," I said cautiously. "I don't know yet," said Daisy, "but I think he's liable to steal something, don't you? Or trick Mummy into giving him something awfully valuable. Snooping around our lovely things and then making out they're worth nothing. Well, Mummy might fall for that, but I won't. Whatever he's planning, we must assume that he's going to do it this weekend, while he's here for the party. All we need is enough evidence to take to Uncle Felix before he can get away with it. Therefore, I need you to get under that cupboard immediately. I'll get under the table here, and we'll watch and listen for all we're worth." I looked at the cupboard. The space underneath it looked fearfully small. "Daisy," I began, but of course Daisy was already hiding, and naturally she had chosen the hiding place with more space. I had no choice but to squeeze under the cupboard. I found it very dark and furry with dust and extremely close. I lay there miserably, the smell of men's cigars drifting out through the closed dining room door, mixing with the dust and tickling its way up my nose. Every time I even moved, Daisy hissed at me like a goose, and by the time the door opened and 10 shiny black shoes came trooping past my face, I was thoroughly cross. Sometimes being part of the detective society is not enjoyable at all. "Billiards?" asked Lord Hastings in his big round voice. "Not for me," said Mr. Curtis, his mirror-polished shoes pausing just in front of my nose. "I've got things to do." "Not business?" asked Uncle Felix in his lightest, coldest tones. "I hope you won't be telephoning at all hours. You are at a party, you know. You must remember to enjoy yourself." "Oh, you mustn't worry about that," Mr. Curtis oozed smugness. "I always remember to enjoy myself. And I promise you, I shall have no use for the telephone. Everything I need is here in Fallingford." I twitched, and the cupboard creaked around me. "I don't like your tone," Bertie began hotly, and then stopped as though someone had put their hand on his arm. "Shh," I heard Stephen say. "Bertie, don't." "Indeed," said Uncle Felix. "Nothing to get upset about. Well, Curtis, we shall leave you to it. Come on, George, Bertie, Stephen, billiards." They walked away, and I heard Lord Hastings say, in what was supposed to be a whisper, "That man! If he wasn't a guest in my house, how does Margaret know him?" Uncle Felix murmured something, and they were gone. Mr. Curtis was left alone in the hall, his shoes paced to and fro across the faded hall carpet. I wiggled my head forward a bit, so I could see Daisy crouching under her table. She made a cross face at me that I knew meant "stay put," and so I drew my neck back again, groaning quietly. Then the drawing-room door sighed open, and a pair of thin high heels came tapping across the stone floor and onto the carpet next to Mr. Curtis's shoes. "Dennis," said Daisy's mother quietly, like a breath out. "Margaret," said Mr. Curtis just as quietly. "Meet you, 9:15, library." "Yes," whispered Daisy's mother, and then the library door itself opened, and out came Miss Alston's blocky brown shoes. "Oh, what a surprise," she said, stopping. "I was looking for the girls to make sure they really are playing hide-and-seek." "They quite clearly aren't here," said Lady Hastings in annoyance. "Really, can't you keep them under control? Whatever do I pay you for?" "You are quite right," said Miss Alston blandly. "I do apologise." But although her mouth was saying the words, I could tell that this was not at all what she meant. She went striding off towards the billiard room, but again I felt that she was doing quite the opposite to what she wanted to. Under all the properness, Miss Alston was just as curious about seeing Lady Hastings and Mr. Curtis together as we were. But for now, the scene seemed to be over. Lady Hastings clicked back to the drawing-room, and Mr. Curtis muttered, "Whiskey," and hurried back into the dining room. I couldn't bear to stay squashed under that cupboard for another moment. I kicked and heaved my way out, bumping my head in the process, and then flopped forward onto the carpet, panting like a fish. Almost before I had time to blink, Daisy was next to me. "Did you hear?" she hissed. "I don't see how I could have missed it," I said, and spat out a ball of dust. "Exactly. Quick, into the library before Alston comes back and sends us to bed. We must be ready for the rendezvous." I paused. There was suddenly a little twinge in my stomach. Yes, I had heard everything that Daisy had, but I wondered if it had meant exactly the same thing to the two of us. Mr. Curtis was up to no good, but I also knew that sometimes grown-ups went into quiet rooms together for very different reasons. What if this was one of those times? Was this a mystery the Detective Society ought to be investigating? "Daisy," I said, "are you sure?" "Hazel," snapped Daisy, "do you want to catch Mr. Curtis being a criminal or not?" I couldn't argue with that.